Hollywood keeps trying to turn Star Trek into a blockbuster franchise, but it's no Star Wars. It just doesn't work at the box office. There have been 13 theatrical movies, and none of them cracked even 500 million. Meanwhile, The Force Awakens cleared $500 million in a single weekend. Here's every Star Trek budget and every flop. Star Wars came out in 1977 and Paramount lost their minds. They'd been trying to develop a Star Trek movie since the show got canceled in 1969. By 1975, they'd gone through so many writers and scripts that they gave up and decided to just make a new series instead, Star Trek Phase 2. Then George Lucas made $600 million. Close Encounters made another $300. Paramount looked at those numbers, immediately canceled Phase 2, and decided they were making a movie after all. Robert Wise got the directing job. He'd won Oscars for West Side Story and Sound of Music, but he'd also done The Andromeda Strain, so he knew sci-fi. They gave him $35 million, same budget as Bond's Moonraker that year, about $156 million in today's money. Problem was, Roddenberry didn't want Wise directing, Paramount did. Those two fought over the vision. Bigger problem was they were in such a rush to capitalize on the Star Wars moment that Wise ended up finishing the movie pretty much on the day it opened. The motion picture opened December 7, 1979 in 857 theaters and set the opening weekend record, made almost $12 million. Beat Superman from the year before, made $139 million worldwide. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $580 million today. Still the highest grossing Star Trek film ever in real dollars. And it's the only original series Star Trek movie that did well internationally too. Got 40% of its gross from outside the US. Every other one barely cracked 20% overseas. But Paramount looked at $139 million and it wasn't Star Wars money. So what they did next was insane. Paramount wanted bigger numbers, so they cut the budget from $35 million to $12. That's the logic. First movie didn't make enough, let's spend a third of what we spent before. They forced Roddenberry out of creative control and basically told the new team to make a cheap sequel to an old TV episode called Space Seed. Reuse sets from the first movie, recycle effects footage, borrow props from other projects, whatever keeps costs down. Wrath of Khan opened with a record weekend, made $14.3 million, biggest opening ever at that point. Went on to make $79 million domestically, became the sixth highest grossing film of 1982, $97 million worldwide. Less than the motion picture made, but it cost almost nothing. Paramount was printing money. Then they got really smart with VHS. Tapes back then cost $80. Paramount sold Wrath of Khan for $40, half price. They expected to sell 60,000 copies. By 1983, it was the best-selling video cassette in history. They'd more than doubled projections. People still call it the best Star Trek film. Critics said it saved the franchise. And Paramount learned their lesson. Low-budget Star Trek works. The sequel worked, so they kept the budget low for the third one. Made it the second part of a trilogy. Leonard Nimoy got to direct this time, first Star Trek cast member to sit in the director's chair. They brought in Industrial Light and Magic, George Lucas's effects company, to do the special effects. Paramount barely marketed it. Wrath of Khan had this huge creative ad campaign, but for Search for Spock, they just printed some calendars and sold glasses at Taco Bell. Turns out even that was enough. It opened June 1st in almost 2,000 theaters. The summer of 1984 was packed. Indiana Jones, Gremlins, Ghostbusters all came out around the same time. More than half the country's movie screens had a blockbuster playing. But Search for Spock still made over $16 million opening weekend. Ended up with $76 million domestic, $87 million worldwide. About $270 million today when you adjust for inflation. It was less than Wrath of Khan, but Paramount was fine with it. As long as these kept making consistent money, they'd keep making them. After Search for Spock, Paramount asked Nimoy to direct again and told him they wanted his vision, actual creative freedom. He took a risk, made a Star Trek movie with an environmental message and no villain. Budget went up to $24 million because they shot on location in San Francisco instead of on sets. Some of the humpback whales in the film were real animals, which cost money, and Shatner refused to come back unless they paid him more. Nimoy and Shatner each got $2.5 million. Their salaries were getting so high that Paramount decided to create Star Trek: The Next Generation with cheaper unknown actors instead. Paramount actually tried with the marketing this time. Star Trek had always bombed internationally, so they made a special trailer for foreign markets that downplayed the Star Trek branding and recapped the previous two movies. They even did a premiere in the Soviet Union. Didn't help. International was still weak, but domestically it exploded. First week out, the Voyage home knocked Crocodile Dundee off the top spot after an 8-week run. Made almost $40 million in 5 days, $14 million more than Search for Spock's opening. Ended up making $133 million worldwide on a $24 million budget. Paramount released 5 of the top 10 movies that year, and this was one of them. The film got 4 Oscars nominations and won several awards. This is Nimoy's masterpiece. I'm glad they let him make it. Leonard Nimoy directed 2 successful Star Trek movies, so William Shatner figured he should get to direct one too. Bad idea. Shatner developed the storyline and took over directing duties for The Final Frontier. Gene Roddenberry hated the original script. Nimoy and DeForest Kelley straight up objected to the premise because it had their characters betraying Kirk. The script got rewritten multiple times trying to keep everyone happy, and they kept cutting the effects-heavy ending because it was getting too expensive. Then production started and everything fell apart. There was a Writers Guild strike that ate into pre-production time. They had problems on set, problems during location shooting in Yosemite, even problems with special effects. Industrial Light and Magic, who'd done the effects for Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock, was too busy working on Indiana Jones. They couldn't meet Paramount's schedule or budget, so Paramount hired a different effects house that claimed they could do it cheaper and faster. The effects ended up being terrible. Test audiences hated the ending, so they had to rework it. Some of the planned special effects just failed completely and had to be scrapped. By the time they finished, everyone involved pretty much hated it and wanted it to go away. Paramount was expecting huge things from this movie. Analysts thought it would make nearly $200 million. It opened in first place with $17 million, highest opening for any Star Trek film at that point. But then it crashed. Second weekend, it dropped 58%. Third weekend, it made only $3.7 million. It stayed in theaters for 10 weeks, shorter than any previous Star Trek film. Final tally was just $70 million worldwide against a $30 million budget. After marketing costs, they barely broke even. The producer later said it nearly killed the franchise. Almost 40 years later, it's still sitting at 22% on Rotten Tomatoes. After that disaster, Paramount's big idea for the next movie was a prequel about the crew as teenagers at Starfleet Academy. Everyone revolted. The fans, the original cast, everybody. Paramount scrapped it and brought back Nicholas Meyer, who directed Wrath of Khan 9 years earlier. Meyer had pitched a title back then called The Undiscovered Country that Paramount rejected. Now they were finally using it. 1991 was Star Trek's 25th anniversary. Paramount went all out on marketing. They even got Nimoy to appear on The Next Generation. The Undiscovered Country opened in 1,800 theaters, made $18 million its first weekend, top movie in America. New franchise record. Went on to make $97 million worldwide. Got nominated for 2 Oscars for Best Makeup and Best Sound Effects. The only Star Trek movie to win the Saturn Award for Best Science Fiction Film. It was the last time the whole original cast worked together. Roddenberry died 3 weeks before it came out. Paramount approved a 2-picture deal for the Next Generation cast halfway through the show's 6th season. They didn't announce it publicly, but internally they decided Star Trek movies were going to keep happening, regardless of what the original cast wanted. After The Undiscovered Country, Shatner, Nimoy, and Kelly all said they were done, but the supporting cast lobbied for another movie anyway. Paramount's solution was to bring in the Next Generation crew for one film where the two generations met. Paramount opened a website for Generations, which was the first time a movie studio ever did that. This was 1994 and fewer than 1 million Americans had internet access at home, but the site still got millions of views. They put out several tie-in video games too. Then somebody leaked the script, and when the bootleg showed Kirk dies in the movie, Trekkies lost their minds. They flooded theaters opening weekend just to confirm it was real. Generations did preview screenings November 17th and made $3 million from 1,500 theaters. Then it opened wide the next day across 2,600 screens and made $23 million opening weekend. It was the top movie in America. It went on to make $76 million domestic and $43 million internationally. Final tally was $120 million total on a $38 million budget, a solid proof that the franchise could survive without Shatner. Two months after Generations made money, Paramount greenlit another one for 1996 with just the Next Generation cast and no Kirk. First Contact became the highest-grossing Star Trek film until the reboot, and it's pretty obvious why. They made an action movie that happened to be Star Trek, instead of a Star Trek movie that happened to have action. Most intense thing since Wrath of Khan. Jonathan Frakes directed it, his first feature after doing TV episodes of Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. Ridley Scott passed on it, John McTiernan passed on it, so Frakes got the job and made it work. The franchise was struggling by 1996, though. Deep Space Nine and Voyager were losing millions of viewers. Fans were still mad Paramount had canceled Next Generation at its peak, and Generations had made money, but critics weren't impressed. First Contact was a test of whether Star Trek could still work, so Paramount marketed it harder than any Trek film since the motion picture back in 1979. It was the franchise's 30th anniversary, and they needed this to land. It opened in 2,800 theaters on November 22nd and made $30.7 million its first week. That made it the top movie in America before getting knocked out by 101 Dalmatians the very next week. But it stayed in the top 10 for a month. It made $150 million worldwide against a $46 million budget. The best international performance Star Trek had ever seen. After First Contact made good money, Paramount relaxed and decided the crisis was over. They gave Frakes $70 million for the next one. Same budget Spielberg spent on Saving Private Ryan that year. Their logic made sense. The Voyage home had been lighter in tone and became the most successful Trek film at the box office. So they figured if they made Insurrection lighter and threw more money at it, they'd repeat that success. Except when you watch Insurrection, you're constantly wondering where the $70 million went, because it looks like a TV movie. Turns out they were reusing sets from Voyager and Deep Space Nine. Insurrection opened December 11, 1998 and made $22.4 million its first weekend, which was down from First Contact's $30 million and down from Generations' $23. It went on to make $70 million domestic and $118 worldwide against that $70 million budget. After theaters took their cut, Paramount lost money. Right before Nemesis came out, the Viacom chairman gave an interview where he said he was proud of the film. Not because it was good, but because it only cost $60 million. When the studio executive leads with budget instead of quality, you know something's wrong. John Logan wrote it, same guy who wrote Gladiator and would later do Skyfall, and Stuart Baird directed it. Baird was a well-known editor making his first Star Trek film, and he had no feel for the material. The movie was bad, and everyone knew it. Marina Sirtis called him an idiot on stage at a reunion panel years later. Paramount released it December 13th, right before the holidays. They'd lowered the budget from Insurrection and brought in Romulans as villains and cast young Tom Hardy, but none of it helped. Nemesis opened with $18.5 million and came in second place behind Made in Manhattan, a Jennifer Lopez rom-com. Then Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers came out the next week and buried it. Nemesis dropped 76% in its second weekend, one of the biggest drops on record. It made $67 million worldwide against $60 million budget. After theaters took their cut, Paramount got back just about $37 million. They'd spent more than that on marketing alone. Paramount canceled all future Star Trek films after that. The franchise that had been part of their slate for over 20 years was done. It stayed dead until J.J. Abrams rebooted it in 2009. Iron Man blows up in 2008 and Paramount's watching Marvel print money. They've got Star Trek just sitting there and they're thinking, we can do that too. And the timing looks perfect. This is 4 years after Revenge of the Sith and nobody's expecting more Star Wars movies. The whole space adventure niche is wide open, so Paramount decides to spend $140 million on a Star Trek reboot. Which seems insane when you realize that no Star Trek movie had ever made more than $109 million domestically. The brand worked on television, the films did okay on home video, but theatrically Trek had always been a comparatively small performer. Nemesis completely bombed just a few years ago. Yet here's Paramount dropping Transformers money on a franchise whose biggest worldwide hit had made a pathetic $150 million globally. The whole thing was a massive gamble. And domestically, it actually paid off. The movie opened a week after a new X-Men film that did over $80 million, and Star Trek wound up outgrossing it by a pretty wide margin. Made $250 million in the US, which is impressive for a franchise that had been dead for years. Even got some Oscar nominations. But internationally was a different story. Trek had never been popular overseas, and this one made only $127 million outside North America, not even enough to push it to $400 million worldwide. Total was $387 million on a $140 million budget. Profitable, but just barely. Still, Paramount figured they had something. The domestic numbers were strong enough to justify a sequel. So the first Star Trek did $256 million domestic, which was the biggest haul in the franchise's history. Even adjusted for inflation, it beat the motion pictures record. And yeah, it didn't clear 400 because of those weak international numbers, but Paramount wasn't worried about that. They'd watched what happened with Nolan's Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. Begins made $371 million worldwide. The budget was $150. Then The Dark Knight came out and did over $1 billion worldwide. That's the blueprint, right? Solid first movie, massive breakout sequel. Paramount thought they could just copy Nolan and do the same thing with Star Trek, except the context had completely changed in just 4 years. In 2009, Star Trek was the closest thing to Star Wars, one of the biggest franchises around in terms of scale. But by 2013, the MCU was already massive. Fast and Furious had become an A-level action franchise, and Disney had bought Lucasfilm, which meant Star Wars was coming back. We were about to get a sequel to Return of the Jedi with Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford all returning. So now people had the Avengers, they had Fast and Furious, they had Michael Bay's ridiculously huge Transformers movies, and the Jedi were about to return. Star Trek Into Darkness got a 3D conversion to boost the numbers and made $467 million worldwide on a $190 million budget. That wasn't big enough, not considering what they spent, and definitely not the breakout sequel Paramount had been hoping for. Three years later, they try again with Star Trek Beyond. $185 million budget. Summer of 2016, which is when every former giant franchise tried to make a comeback and failed. Independence Day, Ghostbusters, X-Men, all of them underperformed or bombed. By now, Fast and Furious is delivering diverse ensemble casts. Star Wars The Force Awakens and Guardians of the Galaxy are both doing swashbuckling sci-fi adventure. The MCU has gotten so big that Ultron and Civil War are some of the biggest movies around. What did Star Trek Beyond have to offer that was unique? Nothing really, beyond just being another Star Trek movie. Beyond opened with $59 million domestically, which was first place that weekend but way behind what the previous two had done. It made only $338 million worldwide. It needed $500 million just to break even. Lost over $100 million. Simon Pegg, who co-wrote it, later blamed the marketing, said they started promoting it too late compared to something like Suicide Squad. But that wasn't really the problem. The problem was that by 2016, nobody needed Star Trek anymore. Too many other franchises were doing it better and bigger. The blockbuster experiment had failed. It's been 10 years since Star Trek Beyond. No big theatrical Trek movies since then, unless you count that streaming thing, Section 31, from last year. At one point, Tarantino was talking about doing a Star Trek film. That's not happening anymore. The franchise for now is dead theatrically.